Because the way the communists win is by convincing everybody to stop objecting to what they're doing. And once that happens, once they can achieve that by making you worry about your job or your social ostracism or having been put in a FEMA camp or whatever you're worried about, once they convince you to shut up, then they can get away with everything.
Welcome back to this week's episode of The Feds, a production of Feds for Freedom, where we seek truth and transparency inside the government. I am Stephanie Weidel. On this podcast, you get an interesting and unique perspective from the American citizens we interview. We want to encourage all watching and listening to be bold, stand their ground, and press onward. Go ahead and follow us so you can be alerted to all the latest episodes. Visit our website and sign up for our newsletter. Become a member at fedsforfreedom.org.
Welcome to The Feds, insiders bringing accountability, integrity, and reform to a broken bureaucracy. At Feds for Freedom, we value constructive dissent and healthy debate. The views and opinions shared in today's episode are those of the speaker alone and do not express the views or opinions of the U.S. government or any other employer.
We are joined today by Jeff Childers, one of the nation's leading attorneys who stands against unconstitutional mandates that violate bodily autonomy. Since March 2020, Jeff has been providing truth, optimism, and hope as the author of the widely read international blog, Coffee and COVID. Thank you so much, Jeff, for coming on with us today.
Thanks, Stephanie. It's great to be here.
Why don't you tell us a little bit of your background? Tell us about yourself and why you became a constitutional lawyer.
Well, that's a big question. The short answer is the pandemic. I was, and still am, a boutique commercial litigation lawyer in the small Florida town of Gainesville, which is about 90 miles straight north from Orlando, the home of the Florida Gators. And I'd been doing that for a while and was pretty satisfied with it when the pandemic hit in March of 2020, and my county became the very first county in Florida to impose a county-wide indoor-outdoor mask mandate. And the day that happened, I just sort of, I think that it was a God thing. I think God told me what I had to do. I never even considered not filing a lawsuit, even though I'd never sued the government before at any level, state, local, federal. That just wasn't my law practice. So within 30 days, I had filed my very first lawsuit against the government, in this case, Alachua County, over their mask mandate. And that's at that time, because our county was the first county, and I was one of the first lawyers in the state to file a mask case. That sort of put me on everybody's radar as one of the very few lawyers willing to take those cases. In particular, there weren't very many litigators at all. There were a lot of volunteer lawyers. Well, when I say a lot, there were a handful around the state, but they were, oftentimes volunteers from transactional areas of practice. And they weren't used to being in the courtrooms, and the judges just, slayed them. But we won. We won that mask case at the appellate level. To my knowledge, that's the only appellate decision in the entire country finding that mandatory masking is presumptively unconstitutional.
Let me ask, when did you realize that the given COVID narratives were not, something was wrong with them? Like all the masking, the social distancing, then the testing, and then eventually the shots.
So I recognized pretty quickly that the media had become monolithic in its reporting over COVID. All you got was bad news. In fact, in that first county commission meeting where they passed the mask mandate, which was the very first county commission meeting I'd ever watched, and it was horrifying. People who have seen that before probably wouldn't be surprised, but I couldn't believe that was how government really worked. But the uh, the one of the county commissioners, the one who proposed the mask mandate, had a little piece of paper. It was like a cocktail napkin or something with scribbling all over it. And he said he had been crunching the numbers, and by his calculations, and this guy's a failed real estate broker who became a county commissioner. By his calculations, the cases were doubling every 2 days. And, if they didn't do something, then within a few weeks, the whole county would be infected. So I'm a lawyer, and I don't take anybody's word for it. I deal in evidence. That's what I have to present in court. So I wanted to see the numbers for myself. And when I went to look at the numbers, I didn't see cases doubling every 2 days. I mean, if you took the very first few days of reporting, there might have been 2 cases on the first day and 4 cases and then 8 cases. But instead of, going up like this, it was just sort of a straight line. And so that was really the first time that I saw the sort of the failure in the system, right? That this guy's making decisions for the whole county, and he's just wrong about the numbers. Even if you don't attribute any malicious intent to him, he was just flat wrong on basic math. And so I was pretty skeptical right from the start, I would say.
So how did you respond? So you were skeptical. You sued the county, but why and how did you get the attention of DeSantis in the state of Florida?
So when I was sitting on the back porch watching that county commission meeting on our outdoor patio TV, and my wife was sitting right next to me, and with that little bit, with no discussion or argument, they 5-0 passed this draconian mask mandate. And I was not a mask person to begin with. It never occurred to me that a cut-up T-shirt could provide any medical advantage for anything. It just seemed dumb to me. So I was shocked and appalled when that happened. And I turned to Michelle, and I think the first thing out of my mouth was, "There's no way that's constitutional. They can't tell us what we have to wear." And so that was based on one semester of con law, way back in law school. I had never done any constitutional law litigation. And, maybe I'd read a few cases over the years on things that, big cases or things I was interested in or whatever. But I was starting from scratch, really. And the idea to sue the governor, at that time, Governor DeSantis is such a household name now. Everybody knows who he is. But at that time, he was not the same Governor DeSantis that we all know and love now. He had barely won the governorship by I think 30,000 votes or something, which in Florida is a razor slice. And the guy he beat was, probably the most unqualified gubernatorial candidate, in my lifetime. It's just a joke. And DeSantis barely beat him. So at that time, DeSantis had not gotten his legs under him at all. I don't think he was confident. But he was the governor. And so my very first inclination was, if I could just if I could get his attention. There was a lot going on, right? All this COVID stuff. I knew he was busy and distracted, but if I could just get him to focus on what kind of crazy hijinks were going on in Alachua County, then certainly he would do something about it. And I wouldn't need to, go the distance with my lawsuit. And so, after a couple of failed attempts to call somebody in Tallahassee, I thought, well, why not just add him as a defendant to the lawsuit? There was a reason why I could do that, not to get into the weeds, but the county was actually claiming that they had authority to do it under an executive order that DeSantis had issued. Now, I disagreed with that, but they did invoke DeSantis as the source of their authority. So it was legit for me to name him as a defendant. And I thought if I put him down as a defendant, they will have to get counsel. And so I'll have a connection to the governor's office, at least through the legal team. And in fact, that did happen. I did, have a couple of fairly robust and impassioned conversations with Governor DeSantis' lawyers, or one of them, and the rest. And the rest of the story.
Yeah, I remember Peggy Hall from the Healthy American talking about, well, if you want to get someone's attention, you sue them. Yep. So what
That's
were you?
my job.
Yeah. So you have filed multiple lawsuits on behalf of freedom fighters. What have you been able to accomplish with those lawsuits?
Gosh, so we've sort of been, up and down the whole spectrum. Like I said, once I filed that mask lawsuit, and then especially once we won it, I really got, on the radar, and we have people calling all the time for help with, one freedom-related case or another, and mostly because lots of attorneys won't take these cases. It's very frustrating. So I've litigated now against school boards. I've handled 5 elections cases. I've litigated, I'm about to file a federal lawsuit against the PrEP Act, probably within the next couple of business days. Gosh, and I'm leaving them out. We litigated over the vaccines a lot. We sued over mandates. We've advised countless people on religious exemptions. I mean, it's kind of, I need to write it down sometime because it's getting away from me.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's for your book. Are you going to write a book at some point and add all of your humor into it?
Yes, I'd like to write the first comedy about COVID.
Yeah. Yes. You're the perfect person for that. You mentioned rightly that finding lawyers to defend freedom fighters has been extremely hard. Still, why is this? Why are lawyers still not standing up and defending the Constitution?
So I think there's not maybe one single answer to that question. As a lawyer, I have a certain degree of sympathy for other lawyers. I mean, we're not required to take cases that we have a moral or ethical problem with. So I think you can, some lawyers are probably in that category of, they're pro-vaccine, for example. And so they just have a moral and ethical problem with suing somebody to stop a vaccine mandate, or to get them ivermectin or something. I think that, probably the most distressing reason is that the medium-sized and large law firms rely on government for a lot of their business. So they represent governments. They represent governors and cities and counties and school boards and you name it in cases, and they don't want to alienate those clients. And that is a real, that is a huge problem, because what I've seen, and I think what most of us have seen, is that this conflict of interest between the larger law firms and government means that they'll never challenge the government seriously. Who's going to stand up for our freedoms if these law firms won't do it when government is unified? And so the good news, though, is that I mean, it probably seemed like it took forever, but in terms of the law, which moves very slowly, independent lawyers like me were able to make a huge difference relatively quickly, not instantaneously, but sooner or later we did started turning around. And now you see, like in some of the Republican attorneys general of some of the better states, they're using large law firms to help them with their cases. So, there is a dynamic that's a little bit more optimistic, but I think still we need to really get to the bottom of that problem, fix it.
All right, let's talk about the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals recent ruling that says that the COVID shots are not vaccines. I mean, this is huge, but what does this mean for government and pharmaceutical accountability?
Yeah, so that was a very exciting case, and I think it's a bellwether case, meaning that it sort of shows a sea change in how courts are addressing these vaccine cases. But there are a couple of important caveats. We don't want to get, overexcited about it because the law is incremental. And I think it's maybe too much to say that the court found that the COVID shots aren't vaccines, being super specific on you. What the court did was accept the plaintiff's allegation that the shots aren't vaccines. So that's a little bit different. The court in that case was not adjudicating the final decision. They were reversing the lower court's dismissal of the plaintiff's lawsuit. So the lower court didn't accept just, you applying its own common sense. It didn't accept that the COVID shots weren't vaccines. But the Ninth said, surprisingly, shocking, the Ninth agreed that they might not be vaccines, and the plaintiffs properly alleged and provided substantial evidence at that stage that they might not be vaccines. Now, so we don't have yet a decision that we can hang our hats on, and start adding on to, but just think about how significant it is that one of the major appellate courts in the country, not just any appellate court, but the Ninth Circuit, right, is willing to entertain that theory. The shots aren't vaccines. And it's, by the way, it said all the right reasons. I mean, it went further and talked about why the shots might not be vaccines, as the plaintiff alleged. And it treated it extremely fairly, rather than just rejecting it out of hand, the way courts were doing in the first few years of the pandemic. That, like, they'd be like, "Oh, what, are you retarded? We're in the middle of a pandemic. What do you want me to do? Shut down the vaccines?" Right? And it's not like that now. Now it seems like the courts are signaling that they're willing to consider these questions, and that's huge. I mean, this is what we've been looking for a long time. It's an open door, an invitation for more lawyers to bring these lawsuits, that the courts will consider them. That's very discouraging to lawyers. The mass cases, I remember, just to give you an example, back in the day when I was still prosecuting my mass case and it was working its way through the system, I was keeping a list of everybody else who was filing mass cases around the state, just Florida. And my list got like over 40 different cases that people had filed, and all of them except mine lost. And it was hard because, every time I would go in front of a judge in my case, there'd be a whole raft of new cases in other parts of the state where people had lost. And the judge would start off by saying, "Childers, I mean, what are we doing here? Judge so-and-so just decided mass are okay. Judge so-and-so and so-and-so." And I'd be like, "Yeah, Judge, I know. That's not my case." And so I would have to dig my way out of a hole before I could even start that day's argument and so that discouraged a lot of lawyers, because look, lawyers, we don't like to lose. That's not why we do this. Any good litigator is like, an Olympic athlete in some sense, in that we're always wanting to beat our competitors and be the the first one across the finish line. So if a case looks like a dead loser, that's going to be discouraging to a lot of lawyers to take. Which brings me back to the Ninth Circuit decision, which is what a wonderful invitation that is to lawyers to see that open-mindedness from a major appellate court and an unlikely one. So that sort of signals even where the more conservative appellate jurisdictions might be in their thinking. And that's why I'm really excited about my PrEP Act lawsuit, because I think we're filing it at the perfect time. And I just feel like there's that sea change in, and I imagine, I don't know, but I imagine judges are just like everybody else, right? And by this point, they probably know a lot of vaccine injured people, like personally, right? Maybe in their own families, maybe themselves.
And would you remind our listeners what the PrEP Act is?
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is the problem with, being a full-time lawyer, the lingo. So the PrEP Act is the federal statute that provides immunity to companies like Pfizer for what the law calls covered countermeasures, which include the vaccine, which are these EUA therapeutics that were deployed during the pandemic without official, government approval, just this emergency use approval. And so that's a special statute. And, I think a lot of people don't realize this. PrEP Act's new. It was only passed in 2015. So it has not been tested before. And so, but it immunized Pfizer, Moderna. It immunized just this incredibly broad community of providers, like the ventilators are covered. They're immunized. Remdesivir is immunized. Basically anything that was CDC approved that went through a hospital has complete liability immunity under the PrEP Act. So I believe that the PrEP Act is facially unconstitutional. And that's what our lawsuit is all about.
Wow. I'm glad you're bringing that forward. I'll be following that. Going back to the Ninth Circuit Court, which is in California for our listeners, beyond just an invitation to bring more cases like this forward and giving it the time of day, does this ruling provide future help for those of us who want accountability for all the harms done to the public during COVID?
Well, I would say unqualifiedly, yes. What we've been discussing, I think, could be better characterized as momentum. Right? We haven't crossed the finish line yet, but we're moving faster and with a lot more weight. And every one of these decisions that comes down, they all add to the weight of the load in the boxcar behind us as we keep pushing down the tracks toward our final destination of, as you put it, accountability, which is where somebody's going to be held responsible for what happened.
How do you speak to people who say, well, nothing, what do you mean? What happened? I mean, we had this pandemic of health. So how do you talk to people whose eyes are completely shut?
Another just tremendous bellwether development was a New York Times article that unexpectedly, out of nowhere, appeared in that paper about maybe a little over 3 weeks ago. And it was not a little article back on page A16. It was a long form magazine style multimedia article about vaccine injuries. And the article included interviews and quotes from, I don't know, more than a dozen vaccine injured people. And what was interesting, although it didn't say that's what they were doing, but what became clear as you read quote after quote after quote of a vaccine injured person is that every one of the people they used for that article was a medical or scientific professional. right? It's kind of like the editors were trying to immunize themselves from criticism that these are just conspiracy theorists and, people who are hypochondriacs or, long COVID sufferers or whatever. And so they restricted the human interest examples that they were using for that story to medical and med-sci professionals. Just think about that. One of them, just to give you one example, is the chief editor of the journal Vaccine. And he's got a chronic vaccine injury. He's got tinnitus, that ringing in your ears that doesn't go away. And that can be a very serious condition. It drives people to suicide. So, and he, the chief editor of the journal Vaccine talked about how he was gaslit by his doctor over his vaccine injury. You couldn't find a more pro-vaccine person than this guy, right? He literally runs the journal that publishes the studies about the vaccines. So to see that appear in the New York Times was so encouraging, and I think it goes to your question. So, the first simple answer is send them a copy of that New York Times article, right? Anybody who is, because there is no more trusted liberal source of news than the New York Times. And the second is, there's been this fog of confusion created deliberately by the government and cooperative media outlets called misinformation and disinformation and conspiracy theories and all of that stuff. So that is sort of a convenient escape hatch for people who don't want to think about the problem, right? Well, that's just a conspiracy theory. That's just misinformation. So the pitch to somebody who is either on the fence or, in the vaccine camp, which is what you asked me, I think the way to approach them is not through the avenue of the vaccines are destructive and dangerous, which I happen to think is true, but from the other end, which is we need to have compassion for people who were injured by the vaccines. And so rather than, challenging them on the science, these are people who, they're not called bleeding heart liberals for nothing. These are people who respond to compassion arguments, right? And so you have this group of people who are being ignored and have no recourse. Nobody's helping, who are vaccine injured. And maybe it's just a small group. Maybe it is very rare. But if you take 300 million Americans, and if it's only 1%, that's 3 million people, right? So it's not a small problem. We don't have to challenge their idea about whether the vaccines, they may have saved 270 million people from dying of COVID. That's terrific. But what about these 3 million injured? What are we going to do for them? And so that's where I think currently the battle line is to recruit more people in by appealing to their sense of compassion for people who are clearly injured. And the New York Times article connects it to the vaccines. And even if we're not sure, it might be the vaccines, it might not be the vaccines. We don't need to argue about that because they're still not getting any help.
So it's amazing. It's not just Democrats. It's also Republicans.
And, tagging on to your questions about when I sued DeSantis at the very beginning. So the reason why I dismissed him pretty quickly after I spoke to his attorney a couple times. And the reason is because the attorney told me that they had done polling of Republicans and 55% of Republicans approved of mask mandates at that time. So he wasn't willing to help because of the politics. Now, to Governor DeSantis' great credit, at some point he drew a line and he's like, no, we're not doing that. And he threw the polls out and he did the right thing and became the governor that we now know and love. But at that time, to your point, establishment Republicans were the ones who were preventing us from getting relief from these, Orwellian mask mandates.
Mm-hmm. Do you think establishment Republicans are keeping us from getting to the point of true accountability?
No, I think that now, if you look at the polls, the Republican Party is probably somewhere between 60 and 70% convinced of all the right things, right? And it's because Republicans, first of all, tend to be more independent. So we're more independent minded. They're skeptical of government, and they're, and apologies to anybody offended by this, but I think they're more logical in the sense that we Republicans, prefer the brain. The Democrats or liberals prefer using the heart, right? And so there are some things that are undeniable now, like masks don't work. Now we can argue about the, whatever respirators with the multiple straps that form a perfect seal on your face and whatever, and that's fine. But that's not what they were telling us to wear, was it? No, they were telling us to cut up T-shirts and strap them around our face, right? Or those balaclavas or whatever, the neck warmers that you could pull up over your nose. I mean, it's the dumbest thing ever. And the 6-foot rule that nobody in government is willing to own now. They're all acting like, oh, it just appeared one day, like they left the office one night when they came back in the morning. Hey, what's this on the conference room table? The 6-foot rule. It's got nobody's fingerprints on it. Yeah. Okay. So, common sense is sort of returning to her throne in a lot of ways. And, what you call, I suppose we could argue over the definition of what an establishment Republican is, but I think by and large, it's the Republican Party in this country that's leading the return of sanity.
Well, you have an astounding ability to take news and information, pieces of information, and fit them into the puzzle of this current world. And your blog, Coffee and COVID, is a source of news and a lot of laughs for people. I have certainly enjoyed. Yes. You've covered a lot of stories that are showing a huge movement towards transgenderism, the normalization of transgenderism through DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. So in our current culture, if you don't affirm someone's gender, you're labeled a bigot. And within the government, we've been noticing that there are now mandates, like through executive order, to call someone by their preferred pronoun. And even HHS, Health and Human Services, has their own bathroom policies for transgenders. So why do you think the government has gotten involved with this, mandating like pronoun usage on its own employees?
So without verging into conspiracy theory territory, I'm going to just go with that the Biden administration must have decided that this is a political winner for them somehow. I can't see it. I think that most parents, obviously not all, but I think the majority of parents, regardless of political party, don't want their kids to be confused by this nonsense. I would add that this is different from the pandemic. I think, people want to compare it or, this is the next big push or, something like that. But you see a tremendous amount of pushback all over the place, right? So in Florida, it's already the state has passed laws against DEI, has passed laws against, the most grotesque forms of pro-transgenderism. Our Surgeon General, the terrific Joe Ladapo, has his Surgeon General's office has created a standard that children should not receive gender-affirming care, and so doctors in this state could be sued for violating that standard. So, you see these large, I don't know if it's even fair to call them pockets. I think it's way bigger than pockets. There's resistance, active resistance to it. The challenge is that for whatever reason, Joe Biden is infesting the White House, and the Democrats control all the levers of power right now. So, we're being forced to tolerate this, and federal employees have it the worst because the president has such, near inviolable power to run the executive branch of government the way he sees fit. Fortunately, the way he sees fit is through drag queens and, rainbow colored lighting and all this other nonsense.
So one of your blog posts went viral in August 2021. It was a post speaking to Christian leaders, laying out the science and the data and calling them to stand up and not be fearful. And now I want to say for our listeners, Feds for Freedom is not a Christian organization. We are an organization that stands up for the constitutionally protected religious freedoms of all people. And we stand for morality and integrity here. What is interesting is that in the Bible, and as a Christian, we hold that to be the word of God. It speaks over and over again that we should not be fearful because God is with us. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord thy God is with you wherever you go. So it was an amazing thing to hear pastors give sermon series on do not fear. And yet they turned around and acted fearfully within their churches and with their policies within their churches. And I know this because I was part of a church who acted that way. So how would you describe the response of the church the past couple of years?
So, first of all, that post that you mentioned, which, like you said, I'll never forget it because it was the most widely read thing I've ever written with millions of views. And it got me canceled off of every platform that I was on and all my financial platforms and everything within 24 hours. And even though it was only addressed to pastors. So, and I got the whole thing stuck in my mind the night before I wrote it, just appeared fully. So I think it was a Holy Spirit inspired message. That's my personal belief. But one of the things that prompted that was I had been asked to talk to the North Central Florida Baptist Pastors Association. And the reason that I had been asked to talk to them was because I had been begging for some church to be my plaintiff for free so that I could sue the county to get the churches open again. On First Amendment grounds. I was 100%, just like with the masks, I was just utterly convinced it was non-constitutional. And not only that, I mean, they literally found, I want you to think about this. I mean, this is so profound. And this goes to your question, and it's so much bigger even than your question. And much more worrisome even, and inexplicable, which is that the government, local and state in particular, but local governments found that churches, listen to this, were non-essential. Churches were non-essential. Okay? The marijuana dispensary was essential, but the church, on the backs of which this country was built, were non-essential. Now, You're nodding because you think that's bad. That's not even the bad part. You want to hear the bad part?
Tell us.
The bad part is that nearly every church acquiesced into being non-essential. I've yet to hear a good explanation of that. What on earth? You would think the pastors would be down at the county commission building if they weren't allowed outside banging on the windows saying, what are you talking about? We are non-essential. Where is the pastor who could make the case that spiritual care is essential in a pandemic? They were silent. Stephanie, what happened? They all closed their churches and started working on setting up video cameras and, figuring out how to use a YouTube Live and all that kind of nonsense. How did it happen?
Either you believe the gospel and that it's so important to every human being, or you do not. And it's like they went that direction and did not see that it was, it's so important to continue following the Lord in person.
Are they essential?
Yes.
You said that. I say that. Where's the pastor saying that?
Well, so this brings up another question. Where does science fit into all this? Because it's almost like science took the place of the Bible as the truth spectrum, right? And so where does science fit into the history of the church?
What was the science behind the 6-foot rule? Was it science?
Nope.
So if it wasn't science, what was it that was motivating everybody? Right? And you already answered that question. And that's what my post was about, right? I hypothesized in that post that the entire world had been possessed by a demonic spirit of fear that was overriding people's rational faculties, right? That was convincing pastors they were non-essential in a pandemic. Now, find me another plague or pandemic in history where the church was non-essential. The church who started the hospital system. There is no rational explanation for it. So if we depart from rationality, we then have to move into the realm of supernatural or parapsychological or something like that. I mean, you can invoke mass hallucination if you want to, but globally, I don't know. I mean, that you can talk about mass hallucination, but it's unsatisfying. So,
well, have you noticed a heart change with the churches or church leaders that you've spoken with, or church members you have spoken with who were fine to go along with it then? But have you noticed a heart change now?
I would, this is a sore point for me. One of the initiatives that's percolating, and I'm like crazy busy all the time, but one of the things that I'm working on that I've hired and paid out of my pocket for employees to help me with is an initiative to convince pastors to start going down to the city commission, to the county commission, to the legislature, and explain why they're essential. Do
you have a big turnout?
I can't get anybody to do it. I cannot get them to do it. And it's to the point now where I don't even blame the county commissioners, because you could at least excuse them for they're secularists. They're a pack of atheists down there. Some of them may go to church here or there, but they're not, believers. They don't know why the church is essential, right? Nobody's ever told them. And so I've talked to pastors in groups. I've talked to them one-on-one. I call them up and I say, listen, and I talk about how the church acquiesced to being non-essential during the pandemic, and they respond just like you have, with shock and horror and admission. And they say, you're right, Jeff. Oh my God, that's terrible. And they agree with it. And I say, okay, so listen, I'm trying to get one pastor to go down to the county commission and speak eloquently for 3 minutes about why it was a bad decision to find that they were non-essential and to educate them, not scold them. You don't have to criticize them. Tell them why the church is, what are we doing in the community? How do we minister to people spiritually? How does the gospel address the spirit of fear? Right? And you would think, and you're nodding and you're like, well, yeah, I mean, it's common sense, right?
Yes. Yes.
It just seems like the most natural thing in the world for a pastor to want to do, especially in light of what just happened. I mean, what's going to happen the next time? If we don't educate these people about why the church is essential, well, when there's the next pandemic or the next martial law invocation or the whatever, right, the churches are going to be right back to being less essential than marijuana dispensaries.
Well, that was one of my next questions. From what you see when the next emergency does happen, do you think the church will respond differently?
Look, there are some standout pastors, right? John MacArthur in California, and a few that like sued all the way to the Supreme Court and got some terrific decisions that are going to protect churches going forward. But apart from that tiny group, I mean, I can't find one in my area who is willing to appear in public talking about the essential nature of the church. And it's maddening to me. And I don't mean to be critical. I mean, I have lots of good friends who are pastors and they're good men and they minister well to their flock. But in this area, I am really confused.
I haven't heard of any rabbis or imams either saying much. Yeah, no one's saying anything. Well, how have these past couple years strengthened your faith?
Well, I mean, my entire life is different than it was pre-pandemic. Every part of it, and in many ways, most ways, better. And none of it is the result of anything I ever planned for myself. It was not, all those goal planning workshops and nothing like this was ever on any of those lists. And I believe it was God's hand directing me through the whole thing. I mean, so, I was already an all-in believer to begin with because of spiritual experiences that I had that, nobody can take away. But having been through the pandemic now, there's nothing that you could show me or say to me that would cause me to question my beliefs.
Well, we only have a couple minutes left, but before we end, I want to ask a couple questions about Title VII. Title VII prohibits, from what I understand, discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or natural origin. And many federal employees who faced clear discrimination based on their vaccination status used Title VII to push back. But they were told that they weren't being harmed, as if like constant testing, as if being barred from the workplace is not harm. But anyway, also folks are facing discrimination now from their unwillingness and to go along with DEI policies because of their religious beliefs. According to my understanding of this, the Supreme Court in the case Muldrow versus St. Louis ruled that an employee does not have to prove significant harm to claim Title VII. So does this have impact for people who are still dealing with the COVID fallout and now DEI policy discrimination?
Yeah. So just like in the pandemic, and by the way, I find this totally fascinating, right? There was only one legal mechanism that worked to protect employees under vaccine mandates. Remember what it was? What was the exemption?
The religious exemption.
The religious exemption, right? The faith exemption. That was it. That was the only thing that worked. Just think about that for a second. If you sit in that, there are some profound conclusions that you can draw. And spiritual ones, and also about the nature of our constitutional system. There are more 9-0 decisions supporting religious liberty in this country from the Supreme Court than any other topic. So similarly, I think that there are two sort of unassailable defenses that federal employees should enjoy. I think they're entitled to the religious exemption when it comes to things like, compelled use of foreign pronouns, bathroom usage, and related kinds of things, and First Amendment, in particular to the mandatory use of particular pronouns. That seems to be a pretty clear First Amendment violation. So, part of the problem is, in particular with this administration, is that it doesn't really concern itself too much with constitutionality. Its strategy seems to be, let's just do it and then see if they can get it overturned in court. That's the best way I can explain the last 4 years. So I think that federal employees should be encouraged. I think you've got great arguments, and I anticipate that you'll win with them. We have a good, solid Supreme Court right now, but again, even liberal courts have supported religious liberties, and I would hope that they would continue to do that.
Yeah. So one more question about Title VII. Recently, Title VII has been expanded to include sexual orientation and gender identity as to not be discriminated against because of those. In the 2023 case Groff versus DeJoy, the Supreme Court held that in order for a business to deny a religious accommodation, the employer must prove substantial increased costs in relation to the conduct of the business. So my question is, who comes up with this? What is substantial, and who actually determines substantial? It's such wishy-washy language, first of all. Any comment on that?
Yeah, so the case you're referring to was a very significant case and a positive development. The Supreme Court essentially overturned, although they called it clarifying, which I guess is like overturning light. But they overturned a previous precedent called the Lemon case. And in the Lemon case, the court said that an employer could get away with denying an accommodation if it had a de minimis cost, which means anything. I mean, that's literally any kind of conceivable cost that the employer could come up with. So, another fascinating part of the pandemic is the reversal in the party's traditional ideological positions. So Democrats used to be the party supporting employees' rights. And supposedly the Republicans were the big corporation people, right, who were anti-union and anti-employees' rights. But the mandates of the pandemic turned that on its head. Now you've got the Democrats who are pushing to give employers more control over the private lives of their employees, and the Republicans standing up for employees. So it's crazy, right? This is the topsy-turvy world that we live in now. But the new decision, I think, is great. To answer your question, this is one of the classic complaints about our legal system, which is that judges get to decide cases using words like whether something's reasonable or not to the ordinary person. Who decides that? The judge. Well, what's reasonable to one person may not be reasonable to another person, and you get into all this murky stuff. And it's like making sausage, right? And so The unfortunate answer to your question is that the system's not perfect. It's just the best system anybody's come up with so far.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. Well, Jeff, this has been really fascinating having you on. It's such an honor to have you. So I have one last question for you. If American citizens could do one thing to combat the corruption and the lies that we have seen and heard in the past couple years, what would it be?
That's a great question. So there's a book that immediately came to mind. Rod Drescher is the author. The book is called Live Not by Lies. Live Not by Lies. And the author is a survivor of persecution under either, I can't remember if it was Soviet communism or Romanian communism, one of the bad ones. And it's a short book, and I recommend it to everybody considering the times that we live in. But what he advocated was always telling the truth, especially when there were consequences for telling the truth. And he's got some, he qualifies a little bit about, being sensible and sane about doing it, but not backing down from saying what's true and what's right. Because the way the communists win is by convincing everybody to stop objecting to what they're doing. And once that happens, once they can achieve that by making you worry about your job or your social ostracism or, having been put in a FEMA camp or whatever you're worried about, once they convince you to shut up, then they can get away with everything.
That's excellent. Thank you, Jeff. Those are excellent words. Well, thank you so much for coming on with us today. It's such a joy to have you.
Yeah, it's been a delight. Thanks, Stephanie. This has been great.
Thanks so much for tuning in. Please like, comment, subscribe to, and share our podcasts. Visit our website where you can sign up for our latest newsletters and become a member of Feds for Freedom at fedsforfreedom.org.